There is a silence that speaks louder than any words, a pause that carries more weight than 1,000 explanations. It is in this quiet space that true listening begins, not the kind of listening that nods politely while the mind drifts elsewhere, but a listening that is fully present, awake, and attuned to the heart of another being. Imagine for a moment someone in your life, a friend, a family member, perhaps even a stranger, speaking not just to be heard, but to be truly understood. Can you feel the weight of their unspoken need? Can you sense the fragility hiding behind their words? Listening deeply is more than an act of attention. It is an act of love. It is a deliberate choice to step into the world of another, leaving behind judgments, assumptions, and the rush to respond. In Buddhism, this echoes the practice of mindful presence, a gentle reminder that each moment offers the opportunity to meet another soul with warmth, respect, and compassion. When you listen with your heart, you open a space where healing begins, where connections strengthen, and where silence itself becomes a bridge between two lives. Think of the last time you felt truly heard. Perhaps it was a fleeting moment, a conversation that lingered in memory not because of what was said, but because of the way someone held space for you fully, without interruption or distraction. That moment, however brief, carries the essence of love in its purest form. It teaches us that communication is not merely about exchanging words. It is about bearing witness to another's experience with unwavering attention and care. Yet, how often do we rush past these moments? How often do we speak more than we listen, filling silences with our own noise, our own urgencies, our own fears? In a world that celebrates speed and efficiency, the art of truly listening has become rare. And it is precisely in this rarity that its power lies. To listen deeply is to offer a gift that costs nothing yet is infinitely valuable. It is an offering of presence, a sanctuary of understanding in a life often crowded with misunderstanding and disconnection. As we embark on this journey together, consider this an invitation, a silent invitation to explore what it truly means to listen, not just with your ears, but with your eyes, your heart, your very being. To step into moments of dialogue as sacred spaces, where every pause, every gesture, every sigh carries meaning. To understand that listening is not passive, but an active form of love that can transform the way we relate to ourselves, to others, and to the world around us. And in this space, you may begin to notice something extraordinary. The very act of listening, when practiced deeply, begins to change you. It softens the edges of impatience, dissolves the walls of judgment, and invites a gentle curiosity about life as it is, without the need to fix, to correct, or to control. There is a freedom in this surrender, a serenity that whispers, "To hear fully is to love fully." So, take a breath and settle into this moment. Feel the stillness. Allow yourself to be present, not just here, but fully, with a readiness to witness, to understand, and to embrace the beauty of connection in its most authentic form. This is the beginning of something simple yet profound. The journey into listening deeply, the journey into love that asks nothing in return but gives everything. Because love, in its quietest, most potent expression, often begins not with words, but with the willingness to hear without interference, to see without judgment, and to be fully present for another soul. And it is in this sacred silence that our journey unfolds, inviting us to discover the depth, the warmth, and the transformative power of listening with an open heart. Words are only the surface. They float in the air, forming sentences, sharing stories, exchanging facts. But beneath them lies an entire world of feeling, of longing, of unspoken truths. To listen deeply is to dive past that surface, to move beyond the literal meaning of words and tune into the rhythm, the subtle vibrations, the silent undertones of someone's experience. Imagine a friend telling you about a difficult day. On the surface, the story may seem ordinary, meetings, delays, a lost opportunity, but listen carefully and you may hear the tremor of frustration hiding behind the laughter, the quiet ache behind the complaints, the flicker of hope beneath the worry. This is where the essence of deep listening resides. In noticing the spaces between words, the pauses, the sighs, the shifts in tone. It is in these delicate spaces that the heart speaks, if only we are present enough to hear it. In Buddhism, this is not merely poetic imagery. It is a profound practice. The Buddha taught that to truly see another being is to recognize the suffering, the joy, the impermanence that shapes their existence. To listen deeply is an extension of this insight, an awareness that life is not just lived in words, but in gestures, in silences, in the subtle dance of emotions that shape every interaction. When we tune into these dimensions, listening transforms from a passive act into a sacred engagement, a form of love that requires courage, patience, and humility. Consider this. In every conversation, there are layers. There is the spoken layer, easy to grasp, familiar and safe. Then there is the layer of emotion, often masked by politeness or self-protection. And beyond that lies the layer of need, the unvoiced desires, fears, and hopes that form the core of someone's humanity. Deep listening invites us to move gently through these layers, without rushing, without imposing, without trying to fix, and simply to meet another soul in its fullness. This is why listening is often more difficult than speaking. Speaking allows control, listening demands surrender. When we speak, we create a world that fits our understanding. When we listen deeply, we step into a world that may not fit our expectations at all. It is messy, unpredictable, and sometimes uncomfortable. But it is here in this space that authentic connection is born. Stories from everyday life illustrate this beautifully. A parent listening to a child cry, not to quiet them but to understand the fear behind the tears. A friend listening to grief, not to offer solutions but to share the weight of sorrow. A partner listening to frustration, not to argue but to witness the pain of unmet needs. In every example, the true message lies beyond the words, and it is only accessible through the attentive presence of a loving heart. Deep listening is also transformative for the listener. As you attune to the subtleties beneath words, your mind becomes quieter, your judgments soften, your capacity for empathy expands. You begin to notice the interconnectedness of experience, that each sigh, each pause, each trembling voice is a reflection of the universal human condition. And with this awareness comes a profound sense of humility and reverence for the lives around you. In practical terms, moving beyond words requires patience and intention. It is not enough to remain silent while someone speaks. One must engage fully, allowing eyes, gestures, and intuition to participate in the dialogue. Notice what is left unsaid. Feel the emotional undertone. Let the pauses breathe. Resist the urge to interrupt, to advise, to fix. This is listening as an act of love. It validates existence without judgment. It honors the heart behind the voice. It creates a sacred space where understanding can flourish. And in these moments, a subtle miracle occurs. The person speaking often begins to find clarity within themselves, simply because someone else is present to hold the space. Their words may stumble, their voice may waver, but the act of being heard fully transforms the conversation into something deeper than communication. It becomes healing, connection, and love in motion. So as we continue, let us carry this awareness into every interaction. Let us remember that beyond words lies a world waiting to be heard, that the true essence of listening is not in responding, but in witnessing with an open heart. This is the skill that nurtures compassion, strengthens relationships, and allows love to move quietly yet powerfully through our lives. To listen deeply, we must first learn the art of being present. It is a simple phrase, yet deceptively profound, being truly here. In a world of distractions, constant notifications, racing thoughts, endless to-do lists, being fully present has become a rare gift, both to ourselves and to those around us. Yet it is in this presence that the power of listening unfolds. Consider the difference between hearing and being present. Hearing is passive. You register the sounds, maybe catch the meaning, and continue with your own thoughts. Presence, on the other hand, requires deliberate attention. It demands that you step into the moment completely, shedding the mental clutter, suspending judgment, and anchoring yourself in the reality of now. This is where silence transforms into connection, and attention becomes an act of love. Buddhism offers a guiding principle here, mindfulness or sati. It teaches us to attend fully to each experience, to observe without clinging, and to engage without distraction. When applied to listening, mindfulness becomes an invitation to notice not just the words someone speaks, but their tone, their gestures, the subtle pauses, and even what is left unsaid. It is in this full attention that empathy is born and the sacred space of understanding emerges. Being present is not always easy. Our minds are restless. We anticipate, we plan, we judge. We may nod and smile, yet internally we are elsewhere. True presence, however, asks us to let go of our mental noise, to meet another person with a quiet, attentive heart. It is not about perfect technique. It is about authentic engagement, about showing without words that we are here, that we see, that we care. Imagine a moment with someone who feels unheard. Perhaps they are sharing a fear, a disappointment, or a secret longing. Your presence alone, eye contact, gentle silence, the small gestures that communicate attention, can create a sanctuary. In that space, the person speaking feels valued, acknowledged, and safe. This is the profound impact of presence. It transforms ordinary conversations into moments of deep human connection. There is also a subtle beauty in the reciprocity of presence. When we anchor ourselves fully in the now, we begin to listen not only to others but also to ourselves. We become aware of our reactions, our judgments, our impulses to interrupt or advise. This self-awareness allows us to soften our responses, to approach dialogue with humility, patience, and compassion. In essence, presence nurtures both the listener and the one being heard. Practical steps can guide this practice. Start by taking a breath before responding, noticing your own thoughts but letting them pass without clinging. Observe the speaker fully, their eyes, their posture, the rhythm of their speech. Resist the urge to formulate answers while they are speaking. Allow silence to exist, recognizing that pauses are not voids but opportunities for deeper understanding. Presence is cultivated in these small, deliberate acts, repeated over time, until being fully here becomes a natural expression of care. Stories illustrate this quietly but powerfully. A teacher noticing a student's hesitation, a partner pausing to feel the weight of frustration in their loved one's voice, a friend simply sitting with grief without needing to fix it. These are the moments where presence works its subtle magic. Through such attention, relationships are strengthened, understanding deepens, and love is expressed without words. And here is the most remarkable truth: presence is contagious. When we offer our full attention, it encourages others to slow down, to notice, to engage with the same depth. It becomes a ripple extending outward, creating a network of mindful, compassionate interaction. In this way, listening deeply does more than connect two people. It fosters a culture of awareness, empathy, and genuine care. So take a moment now to feel your own presence. Let go of distractions. Breathe. Notice the weight of your body, the rhythm of your heartbeat, the space around you. And imagine carrying this attention into every conversation, every encounter, every fleeting moment of human interaction. This is not just listening. This is being fully here, fully alive, fully present, and in doing so, offering one of the greatest gifts we can give, the gift of our undivided attention. And as we hold this awareness, we begin to see that presence is more than a technique. It is a way of life, a bridge between hearts, and the foundation for listening that heals, connects, and transforms. It is here, in this quiet commitment to be truly present, that the next dimension of deep listening begins to unfold. A dimension where listening becomes not just an act of attention, but a tangible expression of love. There is a quiet power in compassion. It is subtle, often invisible, yet capable of transforming the most ordinary interactions into moments of profound connection. When we listen with compassion, listening becomes more than an act of attention. It becomes an expression of love in action. Every pause, every nod, every silent acknowledgement becomes a gesture of care, a bridge to the heart of another being. In our daily lives, it is easy to underestimate the significance of truly hearing someone. We may hear words, but do we hear the pain, the longing, the vulnerability behind them? Compassion asks us to go deeper, to recognize that every person carries their own burdens, their own struggles, often hidden beneath the surface. By choosing to listen with patience and empathy, we step into the world of another and offer something far more valuable than advice or solutions. We offer presence, understanding, and a safe space for the soul. Buddhism teaches that compassion, or Kya-Ru-1E47A macron, is not a passive feeling. It is an active force. It moves through our thoughts, our words, and our actions. To listen compassionately is to embody this force, to allow our awareness and care to meet another's suffering without judgment or interruption. It is not about fixing or changing, but about bearing witness to the full reality of someone's experience. In this witnessing, love quietly reveals itself. Consider the power of a simple act, sitting with a friend who is grieving. You do not offer cliches or quick solutions. You do not rush the conversation or try to redirect it. Instead, you let your presence speak. You let your attentive silence communicate that their pain is seen, acknowledged, and shared. In this moment, compassion transforms listening into a healing act. The listener becomes a vessel for understanding, and the one being heard experiences relief simply from being witnessed without judgment. Compassion in action also requires courage. It is tempting to shy away from discomfort, to retreat from the emotions that make us uneasy. But deep listening calls us to stay, to hold the tension of someone else's suffering without fleeing, and to respond with warmth and empathy. It is in these difficult moments that love is most potent, quiet, steady, unwavering. Stories abound that illustrate this beautifully. A teacher noticing a student's unspoken fear, a friend remaining present while another recounts a painful memory, a partner listening without argument during a conflict. These acts of compassionate attention may seem small, but they carry immense transformative power. They create a space where trust can grow, where wounds begin to heal, and where human connection is reinforced by a silent understanding that I see you, I hear you, you are not alone. Listening with compassion is also a mirror. As we cultivate this quality, we begin to see ourselves with greater clarity and gentleness. We recognize our own vulnerabilities, our own moments of pain and longing, and in doing so, our capacity for empathy expands. Listening deeply to another teaches us to listen to ourselves, to honor our own feelings, and to approach our own struggles with the same tenderness we extend to others. The practice, however, is not without its challenges. It requires letting go of our habitual reactions, the need to solve, to advise, or to redirect. It asks us to resist the urge to evaluate or judge. True compassion in listening is patient, receptive, and unhurried. It allows the conversation, the story, and the emotion to unfold naturally, guided by the principle that every person deserves to be heard fully and authentically. And here lies a remarkable truth. When listening becomes an act of compassion, it transforms both the listener and the one being heard. It becomes a silent dialogue of hearts, a channel for love that does not demand anything in return but gives everything. In this exchange, ordinary moments become sacred, words become vessels of care, and the simple act of paying attention becomes a spiritual practice in itself. So, as we move forward, carry this awareness with you. Remember that listening is not merely about hearing. It is about meeting another soul with the fullness of your heart, about letting compassion guide your attention, and about recognizing that love often finds its truest expression not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, steadfast presence of a listening heart. There is a subtle magic in stories. They have the power to bypass the mind, to reach the heart directly, to awaken empathy in ways that facts or advice never can. When we listen deeply, we step into these stories, not as judges, not as fixers, but as witnesses to the rich tapestry of human experience. And it is here, in the simple yet profound act of being present to someone's story, that love reveals itself most clearly. Consider the story of a young woman, exhausted from a life filled with demands, sitting across from her elderly grandmother. She begins to speak, hesitating, unsure if her worries are valid, unsure if anyone truly cares to hear them. The grandmother, without interrupting, simply listens. She leans in, eyes gentle, her silence as warm as any embrace. In that moment, the young woman's words find a home, and the tension of her heart begins to ease. She feels seen, understood, and loved, not because her problems were solved, but because someone had chosen to be fully present for her. Or imagine a busy office where a colleague quietly shares a struggle with a difficult project. Instead of offering quick solutions or brushing it off, a teammate pauses, makes eye contact, and listens. The act is small, seemingly ordinary, but it carries a profound message. I am here. You are not alone. In that space, trust blooms, collaboration strengthens, and the ordinary rhythm of work becomes infused with human connection. Stories like these are all around us if only we notice. A parent hearing their child's fear about school, a friend listening to heartbreak without offering empty platitudes, a stranger sitting silently with someone grieving in a park. These acts of listening, though subtle, carry immense transformative power. They remind us that love is not always grandiose. Often, it is quiet, steady, and patient, growing in the small moments where we give our attention fully and without expectation. In Buddhism, stories are also teaching tools. The Buddha himself used parables and simple narratives to convey profound truths. Each story invited the listener to step beyond the surface and discover deeper wisdom. In the same way, the stories we encounter in life offer lessons if we listen deeply. They teach us patience, empathy, humility, and the importance of holding space for others without judgment. The transformative power of listening is not limited to positive experiences. Sometimes the most impactful stories are those of pain, loss, and vulnerability. A friend recounting grief, a partner sharing fear, a stranger expressing loneliness. These narratives carry emotional weight that can shake us, move us, and teach us the true meaning of compassion. When we engage with such stories fully, we practice love in its most active form. We allow ourselves to bear witness without interference, to hold another's suffering with care, and to validate their humanity simply by listening. And the beauty is reciprocal. As we listen to these stories, our own hearts expand. We become more attuned to the subtle signals in conversations, more sensitive to the feelings of others, and more capable of offering authentic presence. We learn that listening is not passive. It is a skill, a practice, and above all, a way to connect our own humanity with that of the world around us. Stories also reveal the universality of human experience. Though each life is unique, the emotions behind the words, fear, hope, longing, joy, sorrow, are shared by all. To listen deeply to one person is to touch the collective heart of humanity. We recognize that every struggle, every triumph, every quiet moment of vulnerability is part of a larger tapestry, connecting us all in ways often unseen but deeply felt. So, the next time someone begins to tell you their story, pause. Put aside your phone, your agenda, your assumptions. Let yourself be fully present. Notice the subtle shifts in their voice, the pauses that carry meaning, the unspoken truths that lie beneath the surface. Allow your presence to become a vessel for understanding, a channel for compassion, and a testament to love in action. Because in the end, it is through these stories, the ones we are invited into and the ones we choose to witness, that we come to understand the profound truth. Listening deeply is not just hearing words. It is touching hearts, building bridges, and offering love without expectation. And when we embrace this practice, life itself becomes a classroom of wisdom, connection, and human kindness. To listen deeply to others, one must first learn to listen to oneself. It is an often overlooked truth. The ability to hold space for another begins with holding space for our own thoughts, emotions, and inner rhythms. Self-listening is the foundation of authentic connection, the quiet anchor that allows our presence to be unwavering and our compassion genuine. Many of us live in a state of constant motion, racing from task to task, chasing expectations, silencing the whispers of our own hearts. We hear our inner voice faintly, if at all, drowned out by the noise of obligation and distraction. Yet it is precisely this inner voice, this subtle current of awareness, that teaches us how to listen fully. When we ignore it, we may engage with others, but our attention is fragmented, our empathy incomplete. Listening to yourself begins with stillness. Take a moment to breathe, to notice the sensations of your body, the flow of your thoughts, the stirrings of your emotions. Do not judge what arises. Observe it as a witness, a gentle guardian of your own inner life. This practice, rooted in mindfulness, cultivates self-awareness, the ability to recognize not only what we feel, but why we feel it, and how it shapes the way we interact with the world. Buddhist teachings remind us that understanding the self is a path toward wisdom. By acknowledging our own fears, desires, and attachments, we cultivate clarity. By observing our reactions, impatience, irritation, judgment, we gain the ability to step back, to respond rather than react, to listen without distortion. Self-listening is not indulgence, it is preparation. It is the quiet cultivation of a heart capable of receiving the experiences of others with full presence and compassion. Consider a simple example. You are about to have a difficult conversation with a loved one. Before speaking, you pause and notice your own tension, your desire to be right, your fears of conflict. By acknowledging these inner states, you allow them to exist without letting them dominate the interaction. You become aware of your mental patterns, your habitual reactions, and in this awareness lies freedom. The freedom to listen openly, to respond with care, and to hold space for the other person without interference. Self-listening also reveals the unspoken narratives that shape our interactions. Perhaps we carry old wounds, lingering frustrations, or unmet needs that tint the way we perceive others. When we do not acknowledge these, our listening is clouded, filtered through past experiences rather than present reality. By attending to our inner landscape, we clear the lens through which we hear the world, allowing others' words and emotions to reach us unaltered, in their full depth and nuance. Stories from practice illustrate this beautifully. A meditator noticing anger arise while listening to a partner's complaint learns to breathe into the sensation rather than suppress it. A parent recognizing impatience with a child's questions can pause, center themselves, and respond with patience instead of irritation. In every instance, the act of listening to oneself is inseparable from the act of listening to another. It is the quiet, invisible preparation that transforms attention into love. Furthermore, self-awareness nurtures resilience. Deep listening can be emotionally taxing, especially when encountering pain, grief, or anger. By regularly tuning into our inner state, we develop the ability to recognize our limits, recharge when necessary, and continue to offer presence without depleting ourselves. Listening to yourself ensures that your compassion is sustainable, authentic, and unwavering. Ultimately, the journey of inner awareness reminds us that listening is a dialogue, not only between individuals, but between our inner and outer worlds. To hear the heart of another, we must first hear our own. To understand the unspoken pain or longing in someone else, we must understand our own. And when we cultivate this dual awareness of self and other, we discover that listening deeply is both an art and a practice, a bridge between hearts and a pathway toward wisdom, compassion, and genuine love. So pause, breathe, and turn inward for a moment. Feel your thoughts, acknowledge your feelings, sense the rhythm of your mind. This is not self-indulgence. It is preparation. It is the cultivation of a heart and mind ready to meet another fully, openly, and without reservation. It is here, in listening to yourself, that the true capacity for loving presence emerges. Listening deeply is a gift, but it is not always easy. Our minds are conditioned to wander, to judge, to react before fully understanding. There are subtle traps and obstacles that can quietly undermine our efforts, even when our intentions are pure. Recognizing these challenges is essential, for it is only through awareness that we can cultivate true, compassionate listening. One of the most common obstacles is preconception. We arrive at conversations already carrying assumptions, opinions, and past experiences that color what we hear. We may think we know what someone is going to say, or we may judge their words before fully understanding. These mental shortcuts rob us of the richness beneath the surface. To listen deeply, we must release these preconceptions and meet each moment and each person freshly, as if encountering them for the first time. Another trap is distraction. In our modern world, attention is constantly pulled in 1,000 directions. Notifications, unfinished tasks, lingering worries, they all compete for our focus. Even when physically present, our minds may be elsewhere, drifting through unrelated thoughts. True listening demands deliberate effort, a conscious choice to place our attention fully on the speaker, to let the world outside the conversation fade, if only for a moment. Judgment is perhaps the most insidious obstacle. We evaluate, categorize, and critique without even realizing it. This is wrong. That is trivial. I would have done differently. These thoughts may seem harmless, but they erect invisible walls between us and the person speaking. Compassionate listening asks us to suspend judgment, to witness without interference, to recognize that every human experience carries meaning, even if it differs from our own. Emotional triggers are another significant challenge. A speaker's words may resonate with our unresolved feelings, past wounds, or insecurities. We may feel defensive, angry, or anxious. When this happens, our listening becomes clouded by personal reactions. The art of deep listening requires that we notice these triggers without being consumed by them, holding both our own feelings and the other person's words with gentle attention. There is also the temptation to solve, advise, or fix. We are often eager to respond, to offer solutions, to steer the conversation toward resolution. While well-intentioned, this impulse can silence the speaker, cutting off the very space we are meant to hold. True listening is patient and receptive. It allows the other person to fully express themselves without interruption or imposed direction. Sometimes, simply being heard is far more powerful than any advice we could offer. Even our own internal narratives can become traps, stories we tell ourselves, about our worth, about others' intentions, or about how conversations should go, can subtly distort perception. Awareness of these mental patterns is key. By observing our inner dialogue without attachment, we maintain clarity, remain fully present, and avoid projecting our assumptions onto the speaker's reality. Stories from everyday life highlight these challenges vividly. A parent may struggle to listen to a rebellious teen without recalling their own adolescence. A friend may find it hard to hear a painful confession without reacting defensively. A partner may want to solve a loved one's problems instead of simply offering presence. Each scenario presents obstacles, yet each also offers an opportunity, the chance to recognize the traps, to practice patience, and to deepen the capacity for compassionate listening. Buddhist teachings remind us that awareness is the first step toward liberation. By recognizing these obstacles, we can approach listening not as a passive act, but as a mindful practice. We learn to notice when our minds drift, when judgment arises, when impatience stirs. With gentle persistence, we cultivate the skill to return attention to the present, to suspend reactions, and to hold space with unwavering presence. And here is the remarkable truth. The very challenges that make listening difficult are also what make it transformative. Each distraction, each judgment, each emotional trigger is an invitation to grow. They teach us patience, humility, and the deep value of presence. They remind us that listening is not merely about the other person. It is a mirror reflecting our own humanity, our own growth, and our own capacity for love. So, when you encounter the obstacles, the wandering mind, the urge to judge, the impulse to fix, pause, take a breath, return to the present. Let awareness guide you. Each moment of noticing, each act of patience, strengthens the practice of deep listening and transforms it into something far greater than understanding. It becomes a living expression of love, empathy, and connection. Listening deeply is not just a personal practice. It is a force that radiates outward, shaping the world around us in ways both subtle and profound. Every act of attentive, compassionate listening creates ripples, touching lives, strengthening bonds, and transforming relationships into spaces of trust, understanding, and love. Consider a simple interaction, a partner sharing the stress of a long day. When the other listens fully, not distracted, not judgmental, not rushing to offer solutions, a quiet shift occurs. The speaker feels seen, valued, and understood. Tension softens. Hearts open. What might have been a fleeting exchange of words becomes a moment of connection that deepens the relationship. This is the ripple effect in action. One act of true listening touches the emotional fabric of a bond, subtly reshaping it toward trust and intimacy. Families, too, are profoundly impacted by this practice. A parent who listens attentively to a child's fears or dreams fosters a sense of safety and validation. Children learn that their voices matter, that their feelings are respected, and that their inner world has a place of honor in the family. These lessons do not remain confined to a single conversation. They echo through years of growth, shaping self-esteem, empathy, and the ability to listen and care for others. In friendships, deep listening is the glue that holds connections strong even across distance or conflict. A friend who consistently offers full attention becomes a sanctuary, someone whose presence is reliable and reassuring. In moments of struggle, these friendships thrive because the foundation of trust and understanding has been cultivated long before challenges arise. One conversation, one pause, one gesture of attention can set off a chain reaction, strengthening bonds that might have seemed fragile. The ripple effect extends into professional and community life as well. In workplaces, teams where members practice deep listening experience higher collaboration, empathy, and creative problem solving. Conflicts are resolved with greater clarity because each voice is acknowledged, each concern is recognized, and solutions emerge from understanding rather than reaction. Communities flourish when individuals commit to being fully present for one another, listening not to respond, but to understand, support, and connect. But this ripple is not limited to positive experiences. Listening deeply also has the power to diffuse tension, heal misunderstandings, and transform difficult relationships. Imagine encountering someone whose words or actions have caused frustration or pain. By choosing to listen openly, to understand without immediate judgment or retaliation, we create space for reconciliation, for empathy to flourish where resentment might have taken root. A single act of presence can shift the course of a relationship, transforming conflict into opportunity for growth and deeper connection. Stories from everyday life illustrate this beautifully. A coworker noticing a colleague's quiet struggle offers a listening ear and subtle encouragement, prompting confidence and resilience. A parent responding with patience to a child's emotional outburst fosters trust and mutual respect. A friend holding space during heartbreak allows healing to begin. Each small act multiplies, sending ripples outward that touch more lives than we can see. Buddhist wisdom reinforces this truth. Compassionate attention is not contained, it spreads naturally. When we cultivate mindfulness, empathy, and loving presence in our interactions, we not only transform our own hearts, but we also influence the hearts of those around us. Every conversation becomes an opportunity to practice this ripple effect, to sow seeds of connection, understanding, and love that extend far beyond the immediate moment. And perhaps the most beautiful aspect of this ripple is its silent, invisible nature. Often, we do not see the full extent of the impact our listening has on others. A kind word, a patient pause, a moment of attentive presence may resonate for days, weeks, or even years in ways we cannot measure. Yet the energy spreads, quiet but powerful, transforming relationships and ultimately the broader world into a more compassionate, understanding, and connected place. So as we practice listening deeply, let us remember this. Each act of genuine attention is not isolated. It touches, transforms, and uplifts. It teaches patience, nurtures empathy, and strengthens the bonds that make life meaningful. In every conversation, in every pause, in every silent gesture of presence, the ripple effect continues, expanding outward, shaping hearts, and creating the subtle, profound currents of love that move through our lives and the lives of those around us. There is a subtle truth in the art of listening. When we listen deeply, we are not only connecting with another person, we are also cultivating wisdom within ourselves. Listening in its purest form is a spiritual practice, a way to quiet the mind, open the heart, and perceive the world as it truly is. It is through listening that insight arises, understanding blooms, and the path of wisdom unfolds. In Buddhism, wisdom, or prajna, is not simply knowledge. It is the profound understanding of reality, the impermanence of life, the interconnectedness of all beings, and the nature of suffering and liberation. To listen deeply is to align with this wisdom. When we listen without distraction, without judgment, without clinging, we witness the unfolding of truth in another's words, their silences, and the emotions that color them. Each act of listening becomes a meditation, a step on the path toward clarity and insight. Consider a teacher or a spiritual guide. Their lessons are not always in what they say, but in the presence they offer. Students observe, feel, and internalize through attention, through being heard and acknowledged. Similarly, in every conversation, every shared moment, we are both students and practitioners. Listening becomes the medium through which we understand the human experience, ourselves, and the world around us. The practice of spiritual listening also demands humility. We must approach every dialogue with the awareness that we do not know fully, that the truth resides not in our assumptions, but in the depth of another's experience. This humility opens the mind and heart, allowing insight to emerge naturally. We learn not to control, not to manipulate, not to impose, but to receive the wisdom inherent in each moment and each interaction. There is a remarkable teaching here. The world speaks to us continuously, not only through words but through gestures, through emotions, through life itself. Listening deeply is an acknowledgement of this sacred dialogue. It is an invitation to step into awareness, to witness the fleeting nature of feelings, the subtle shifts in energy, and the impermanence of all things. By attending fully, we participate in the dance of existence with presence, clarity, and reverence. Spiritual listening also transforms our understanding of self and other. When we listen with genuine attention, we notice that the boundaries between ourselves and others are not rigid. We recognize shared suffering, shared joy, and the universal threads that connect all beings. This insight cultivates compassion, not abstract but lived and immediate. We begin to understand that every act of listening is also an act of loving kindness, an ethical practice, and a pathway toward awakening. Stories from practice illustrate this beautifully. A monk sitting silently with a visitor, offering no advice but complete presence, allows the visitor to discover their own insight. A practitioner listening to a friend's grief without interruption provides a space where understanding and acceptance naturally arise. In these moments, listening becomes sacred, a mirror reflecting our own inner state, a lens through which wisdom and compassion meet. The spiritual path of listening is not about perfection. Thoughts will wander, judgments will arise, emotions will flare. Yet the practice lies not in eradicating these moments, but in returning, moment by moment, to full presence. Each conscious choice to listen with openness, patience, and attention strengthens the mind, purifies the heart, and brings us closer to the wisdom that recognizes the interconnectedness of all life. Ultimately, listening as a spiritual practice transforms our experience of reality. It teaches us that words are not merely information, but vehicles of truth. It reminds us that silence is not emptiness, but the fertile ground where understanding grows. And it shows us that the heart, when attentive, becomes a sanctuary, a source of insight, and a conduit for love that moves beyond self and ego. As we embrace this practice, we begin to see listening not as a passive act, but as a conscious alignment with the deepest principles of life: mindfulness, compassion, and wisdom. Each conversation, each pause, each silent gesture becomes an opportunity to awaken, to connect, and to touch the essence of another being with reverence. And in doing so, we discover that the path of wisdom is not found in solitary meditation alone, but in the tender, attentive, loving practice of listening deeply to the world and to the hearts that inhabit it. As we come to the close of this journey, one truth remains clear: the greatest gift we can offer another is our presence. Words may fade, advice may be forgotten, but the act of truly listening, of being fully present, resonates far beyond the moment. It lingers in the heart, quietly shaping understanding, empathy, and love. Presence is not merely the absence of distraction. It is the active engagement of the mind and heart. It is the willingness to set aside judgments, to quiet our inner chatter, and to meet another soul exactly as they are. In doing so, we create space for trust to grow, for pain to be softened, for joy to be shared, and for understanding to blossom. Presence is the thread that weaves human connection into something sacred and enduring. The journey of deep listening has shown us that attention is a form of love, compassion is an act of courage, and awareness is a path to wisdom. Each chapter has revealed a layer: the silent invitation, the essence beyond words, the practice of being fully here, the ripple effect of empathy, the lessons hidden in stories, the inner awareness that shapes our capacity to listen, the obstacles and mind traps that challenge us, and the spiritual depth that listening can unlock. And now, we understand that these are not separate lessons. They are facets of the same truth. To listen is to love, to be present is to awaken. Life moves quickly and the world often pulls us in 1,000 directions. Yet in every interaction, whether with a loved one, a friend, a stranger, or even ourselves, there exists the opportunity to practice presence. A pause in conversation, a gentle gaze, a silent acknowledgement, these small acts are profound. They ripple outward, touching hearts we may never fully see, leaving impressions that endure longer than words, longer than time itself. Buddhist teachings remind us that awareness, compassion, and presence are not abstract ideals. They are lived practices, daily choices that shape the quality of our experience and the lives we touch. When we listen deeply, we honor the impermanence of life, the shared humanity of all beings, and the preciousness of each fleeting moment. Presence transforms ordinary interactions into sacred encounters, and listening becomes both a path and a gift. So take this practice into your life. Let your attention be wholehearted, your mind gentle, and your heart open. Listen to the words, the pauses, the silences, and the emotions that move beneath them. Listen to yourself, to the whispers of your own heart, and let the gift of presence flow naturally from your being, quietly, humbly, and powerfully. Because in the end, presence is more than a skill, more than a method, more than a moment. It is a gift that heals, connects, and transforms. It is love in action, wisdom in motion, and the thread that binds us to one another in our shared journey through life. And when we give this gift freely, without expectation, we discover the profound truth that listening deeply is not only an act of love, it is the very essence of being alive. And if this message of presence and deep listening has touched your heart, consider joining our journey. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom to explore more teachings, stories, and reflections that nurture mindfulness, compassion, and inner peace. Turn on notifications so you never miss a moment to pause, listen, and awaken. And remember, each time you choose to be fully present, you are offering the greatest gift, both to yourself and to the world around you.